Sometimes the people the world forgets are the ones with the most fight left in them. And sometimes it takes another forgotten soul to see it. Jonas Hale was 62 when he traded his last $5 for a cabin everyone said was cursed. He had nothing left, just a mule, a rifle, and too many years of wandering. The cabin sat alone near Willow Creek, its roof sagging and windows dark. Jonas expected emptiness. Instead, he found a woman in a wheelchair by the cold hearth. Her name was Clara. She'd been abandoned there, left to survive on her own. Would Jonas walk away like everyone else had, or would he stay? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The transaction had taken less than 5 minutes. Jonas stood outside the land office in Willow Creek, holding a piece of paper that said he owned something. The feeling was strange. For 30 years, he'd owned nothing but what he could carry on his back or tie to his mule. Now he had a cabin. A cursed one, if the clerk was to be believed. You sure about this? The clerk had asked, eyeing Jonas with a mixture of pity and curiosity. That place has a history. Folks don't last there. Jonas had simply nodded and pushed the $5 bill across the counter. It was all he had left from selling his saddle in the last town. He'd kept his father's rifle and the mule, a stubborn old mare named Sadie, who'd been with him for 12 years. Everything else had been sold or lost or left behind, on trails that all looked the same after a while. The mountains around Willow Creek rose up like old guardians. Their peaks still touched with snow, even though it was late spring. Pine trees covered the slopes in dark green waves, and the air smelled clean in a way that made Jonas's chest ache. He'd grown up in mountains like these, back in Colorado, back when he'd had a wife and a daughter and a life that made sense. That was before the fever came through, before he buried them both in the same week and walked away from everything he'd built. That had been in 1843. It was 1875 now, and Jonas had spent those 32 years drifting from ranch to ranch, mine to mine, never staying long enough to remember people's names or let them remember his. But he was tired now. Bone tired. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. He'd woken up one morning in a boarding house in Silver City and looked at himself in a cracked mirror. The man looking back had white in his beard and lines around his eyes that told stories he didn't want to remember. That's when Jonas decided he needed to stop moving. Just stop. The cabin was 3 miles outside town, up a winding trail that followed a creek. The sound of water over rocks had always calmed Jonas, and he found himself relaxing as Sadie picked her way up the path. The trees grew thick here, filtering the afternoon sunlight into golden shafts that lit up the forest floor. Wildflowers grew in patches, Indian paintbrush and columbine, and somewhere nearby a woodpecker hammered against a tree. When the cabin came into view, Jonas had to admit it looked worse than he'd imagined. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired horse's back. One shutter hung crooked, and the other was missing entirely. The porch steps had gaps where boards had rotted through. But the stone chimney stood straight, and the walls looked solid enough. It was built from pine logs, chinked with mud and moss, probably 40 years old or more. Jonas dismounted and tied Sadie to a post that looked sturdy enough. The mule immediately started cropping the tall grass that grew around the cabin. Everything was overgrown. Lilac bushes had gone wild along one side, and vines climbed the walls like they were trying to pull the whole structure back into the earth. He stood there for a moment, taking it in. This was his now, this broken-down cabin with its leaky roof and crooked shutters. The thought should have depressed him, but instead Jonas felt something like relief. At least it was something. At least it was a place to stop. The sun was lowering toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the clearing. Jonas grabbed his bedroll and rifle from Sadie's back and turned toward the cabin door. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. A creak. Wood under weight, movement. Jonas froze, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle. Could be an animal. Bears sometimes denned in abandoned buildings, or it could be a squatter. He'd run into that before, drifters who claimed a place was theirs just by virtue of being there first. He approached the door slowly, rifle held ready but not aimed. The door was closed but not latched. Jonas pushed it open with his boot, letting it swing wide while he stayed to the side. The interior was dim, lit only by the fading daylight coming through the doorway and the one window. Jonas's eyes adjusted slowly. There was a fireplace, cold and dark, a table rough-hewn but solid, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against one wall, and there, in the corner by the hearth, something that made Jonas's breath catch in his throat. A woman sat in a wheelchair made from what looked like old barrel wood and wagon wheels. She was thin, too thin, with dark hair pulled back from a face that might have been pretty if it wasn't so drawn with fear and something harder. Her hands gripped the armrests of the chair, knuckles white. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him with eyes that were sharp and scared and defiant all at once. Jonas stood in the doorway, rifle still in his hand, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A woman alone in a wheelchair, in the cabin he'd just bought. "I don't want trouble," she said finally. Her voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. "But I won't go easy either." Jonas slowly lowered the rifle, though he didn't set it down. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. I just bought this place, down at the land office. They said it was empty." "They lied," she said simply. "Or they didn't care enough to mention me. Most folks pretend I'm not here." There was bitterness in those words, but also a kind of acceptance that made Jonas's chest tighten. He'd heard that tone before, in his own voice, when he talked about the things he'd lost. "What's your name?" Jonas asked, setting his rifle against the wall by the door, but staying where he was. The woman studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he was worth the truth. "Clara," she said finally. "Clara Byrne. And before you ask, no, I don't have anywhere else to go." Jonas nodded slowly, his mind working through the situation. He could leave, walk back down that trail, demand his $5 back, find somewhere else to die in peace. That would be the simple thing, the smart thing probably. But something in Clara's face stopped him. It wasn't the fear or the defiance. It was something underneath both, a kind of strength that Jonas recognized because he'd seen it in a mirror once. Long ago, when he'd decided to keep living, even though he didn't particularly want to. "How long have you been here?" Jonas asked. 5 years, Clara said. "Since the fire?" Jonas waited, but she didn't elaborate. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind in the pines outside and the distant call of a crow. "I'll make us some coffee," Clara said finally, wheeling herself toward the fireplace with practiced efficiency. "Then we can figure out what comes next." Jonas watched as she maneuvered the chair, clearly homemade but cleverly designed, and began building a fire with wood stacked within easy reach. Her movements were deliberate and sure. This was someone who'd learned to survive on her own terms. He picked up his rifle and bedroll and stepped fully into the cabin, closing the door behind him. Outside, Sadie whinnied softly, and somewhere in the forest, nightbirds began their evening songs. Jonas Hale had come to this mountain to find a place to die in peace. Instead, he'd found Clara Byrne, and though he didn't know it yet, that $5 cabin was about to teach him that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances, and that it's never too late to find a reason to keep fighting. The coffee was bitter and strong, made from grounds that had clearly been used more than once. Clara poured it into 2 tin cups with steady hands, passing one to Jonas across the rough wooden table. He sat in one of the chairs, testing it first to make sure it would hold his weight, while Clara positioned her wheelchair across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jonas sipped the coffee and looked around the cabin with new eyes. Now that he was inside and his heart had stopped pounding, he could see the details. The place was clean, surprisingly so. The floor had been swept and the corners were free of cobwebs. Shelves lined one wall, holding jars of preserved vegetables and fruits, bags of dried beans, and what looked like smoked meat wrapped in cloth. A butter churn sat in the corner. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters. This wasn't the home of someone barely surviving. This was the home of someone who'd figured out how to live. "You've been alone this whole time?" Jonas asked finally. Clara took a sip of her coffee before answering. "Mostly there's a boy in town, Timothy. He brings me supplies sometimes. Flour, salt, things I can't make or grow myself. I pay him when I can with preserves or sewing, and your family." Clara's face hardened slightly. "Gone west. Oregon, I think. Maybe California. They left 5 years ago, right after the fire. They left you behind." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "I wasn't much use to them anymore. The wagon couldn't accommodate a wheelchair, and I couldn't walk. They said I'd slow them down, get them all killed on the trail. They left me here with 6 months of supplies and a promise to send for me once they got settled." She smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I'm still waiting on that letter." Jonas felt anger stir in his chest, a hot, righteous anger he hadn't felt in years. What kind of people left their own blood behind like unwanted furniture? "The fire," he said. "That's what happened to your legs." Clara's hands tightened around her cup. "The fire happened at night. Our old cabin, the one that used to stand about 100 yards from here, it went up fast. Pine burns hot. My mother didn't make it out. My father and brothers got me out, but a beam fell. Crushed my legs." She said it matter-of-factly, as if she were describing the weather. "The doctor in town did what he could, but there was too much damage. Said I'd never walk again." "I'm sorry," Jonas said, and meant it. Clara shrugged. "It was a long time ago. I've made my peace with it." But Jonas could see she hadn't, not really. There was something in her eyes when she talked about her family, a wound that hadn't healed right, like a bone that set crooked. "So you've been here, in this cabin for 5 years, Jonas said. "Alone, mostly alone. Timothy comes by every week or two. And Sarah, she runs the general store in town. She sends things sometimes. Thread, needles, fabric. I do sewing work for her. Mending, alterations. She sells them in the store." Clara met his eyes directly. "I'm not a charity case, Mr. Jonas. Just Jonas. I'm not a charity case, Jonas. I work for what I have. I grow what I can in the summer, preserve it for winter. I hunt small game with snares. I collect rainwater and melt snow. I've survived this long without anyone's pity, and I don't need it now." There was pride in her voice, fierce and unbending. Jonas respected that. He'd always respected people who refused to give up, even when giving up would be easier. "I wasn't offering pity," Jonas said quietly. "I was just trying to understand the situation." Clara studied him for another long moment. "And now that you understand it, what are you going to do? Are you going to demand I leave? Try to throw me out?" Jonas shook his head. "I bought this place to stop running, to have somewhere to rest my bones. But I'm not in the business of throwing out women who've earned their right to be here more than I have." "Then what?" Clara asked. "You'll stay here too? We'll just share the cabin like it's a boarding house?" "I don't know yet," Jonas admitted. "I'm still working that part out." Outside, full dark had fallen. The fire Clara had built cast dancing shadows on the log walls, and the coffee had warmed Jonas from the inside. He felt more alert now, more present than he had in months, maybe years. "You can have the bed," Clara said finally. "I usually sleep there, but I can manage on the floor near the fire." "Absolutely not," Jonas said firmly. "I've slept on the ground more nights than I can count. One more won't hurt me. You keep the bed." Clara looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Jonas's tone must have told her it wouldn't do any good. Instead, she wheeled herself over to the bed and with practiced movements transferred herself from the chair to the mattress. Jonas turned away to give her privacy, busying himself with spreading his bedroll near the fireplace. When he looked back, Clara had settled under a patchwork quilt, propped up slightly on pillows. The wheelchair sat empty beside the bed, a silent testament to both limitation and adaptation. "Jonas," Clara said into the darkness, her voice softer now. "Why did you really buy this place? A man doesn't spend his last $5 on a cabin everyone says is cursed, unless he's either desperate or doesn't care what happens to him." Jonas lay back on his bedroll, staring up at the dark beams of the ceiling. "Maybe a bit of both," he said honestly. "I lost my wife and daughter 32 years ago. Fever took them in the same week. I've been moving ever since, never staying anywhere long enough to remember why I was moving in the first place. I woke up a few weeks back and realized I was tired of drifting, tired of not having a place to call home. Tired of not mattering to anyone. So you came here to die, Clara said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. I came here to stop, Jonas corrected. There's a difference, is there? Jonas thought about that. I'm beginning to think there might be. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then so softly he almost didn't hear it, she said, I'm glad you stayed. For tonight, at least. Jonas didn't answer, but something in his chest, something he'd thought was dead and buried with his family, stirred slightly. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something smaller and more fragile. Possibility, maybe. The idea that tomorrow might be different from all the yesterdays he'd been carrying around. He closed his eyes and listened to the fire crackle and pop, to the wind in the pines outside, to the sound of Clara's breathing as it slowly evened out into sleep. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jonas Hale slept without dreaming of graves. 2 weeks before the eviction deadline, Jonas and Clara had assembled a small collection of documents that might help their case. Letters with postmarks showing Clara had received mail at the cabin address for 5 years. Receipts from the general store with dates spanning back to just after the fire. The old tax notice addressed to her father. It wasn't much, but Judge Whitfield said it might be enough if they could find that third witness. The problem was that everyone in Willow Creek either worked for Wade or owed him money. Fear had a way of making people look the other way, and Jonas couldn't blame them for it. A man with a family to feed couldn't afford to lose his job over principle, no matter how much he might want to help. Jonas had started making improvements that were visible from the trail. A new fence around the garden plot, fresh chinking in the cabin walls, a proper woodshed with a shingled roof. If anyone came to assess the property, they'd see clear evidence of occupation and care. Clara had her own way of contributing. She'd begun teaching Jonas about the land, which plants were edible, where the deer came to drink at dawn, how to read the sky for weather. She showed him her snare lines and her system for collecting rainwater. She taught him which mushrooms were safe and which would kill a man before sunset. You've built something remarkable here, Jonas said one afternoon as they worked together preparing vegetables for preserving. Most people with all their limbs working couldn't have survived what you've survived. Clara's hands didn't pause in their work. I didn't have a choice. Survive or die, those were my options. I chose to survive. It was more than that. You chose to live with dignity. That's different. Clara looked up at him and something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. Jonas felt it settle in his chest, warm and unexpected. He was falling in love with this woman. Not because she needed rescuing, but because she didn't. Not because she was helpless, but because she was strong in ways that made his own strength look simple by comparison. He hadn't planned on it. Hadn't wanted it, really. Love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain when it was taken away. He'd learned that lesson 32 years ago, and had spent decades making sure he'd never have to learn it again. But here it was anyway, stubborn and undeniable. Growing in the spaces between their conversations and the comfortable silences they shared while working side by side. Jonas was loading split wood into the shed when he heard hoofbeats approaching. He straightened, his hand moving to the rifle that now lived within easy reach. 3 riders emerged from the trees, hard-looking men with the kind of eyes that said they'd done things they weren't proud of and stopped caring about it. The man in front was thick through the shoulders, with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. He sat his horse like a man who knew how to use violence and wasn't afraid of it. You must be Hale, the man said. His voice was rough like gravel in a bucket, depends on who's asking. Name's Dutch Keller. I'm Mr. Wade's foreman. Dutch spat tobacco juice onto the ground. Mr. Wade sent me to deliver a message. I got his lawyer's message already. The eviction notice. That was the polite message. This is the other kind. Dutch leaned forward in his saddle. Mr. Wade is a patient man, but his patience has limits. He's heard you've been making improvements to his property. He's heard you've been talking to people in town, asking questions. He doesn't appreciate it. Jonas set down the armload of wood he'd been carrying. This property's legal status is in question. Until a judge rules otherwise, I'll do what I need to do. Dutch smiled, but there was no humor in it. See, that's where you're wrong. There's no question about the legal status. Mr. Wade owns this land. He has the deed, signed and registered. What you're doing is called trespassing. What you're doing to his property, that's called vandalism. Mr. Wade could have the sheriff arrest you right now if he wanted. Then why doesn't he? Because he's giving you a chance to be smart about this. Take the woman and leave. Mr. Wade will even throw in $100 for your trouble, double what he offered before. That's generous, considering you've got no legal leg to stand on. And if we don't take his generous offer... Dutch's smile faded. Then accidents start happening. Fires can be tricky things in these mountains. So can falling trees. A man working alone in the woods. Anything could happen to him. And a woman in a wheelchair all by herself. Well, that's just dangerous, isn't it? Jonas felt rage building in his chest, hot and familiar. He'd felt it before, years ago, when powerful men had threatened people who couldn't fight back. He'd walked away from those fights, told himself it wasn't his problem. But he wasn't walking away from this one. You threatening us? Jonas asked quietly. I'm explaining reality, Dutch said. Mr. Wade gets what he wants. Always has, always will. You're just a speed bump, old man. You can move, or you can get run over. Your choice. Jonas took a step closer to Dutch's horse. The other two riders tensed, hands moving toward the guns on their hips. But Jonas kept his focus on Dutch. You go back and tell your Mr. Wade something for me, Jonas said, his voice steady and cold. Tell him we're not leaving. Tell him we're going to fight his eviction in court. And we're going to make enough noise that everyone in the territory knows what kind of man he really is. Tell him that if anyone gets hurt, if this cabin burns, or Clara gets threatened, or anything at all happens that smells wrong, I'll make it my life's work to see him pay for it. I've got nothing to lose, and that makes me more dangerous than he realizes. Dutch studied Jonas for a long moment. Then he laughed, a harsh barking sound. You've got stones, I'll give you that. But stones don't stop bullets, old man. You remember that when things get difficult. He wheeled his horse around, and the three men rode back down the trail, disappearing into the trees. Jonas stood there for a moment, his heart pounding, his hands clenched into fists. He'd made an enemy today, a powerful, dangerous enemy. The door opened behind him, and Clara wheeled herself onto the porch. I heard, she said. Jonas, maybe they're right. Maybe we should just... No, Jonas said firmly. He turned to face her. I'm not letting them chase us off with threats. That's what Wade counts on, people being too scared to stand up to him. Well, I'm not scared. Not of Dutch Keller, and not of Garrett Wade. You should be, Clara said quietly. These men don't make empty threats. If they say accidents will happen, then we'll be careful. We'll watch our backs. But we're not running. Jonas climbed the porch steps and knelt in front of her wheelchair, taking her hands in his. Clara, I've spent 30 years running from everything that mattered. I'm not running anymore. Not from this. Not from you. Clara's eyes searched his face. From me. Jonas realized what he'd said, but he didn't take it back. These past few weeks, working together, talking together, I felt more alive than I have since before my wife died. You've reminded me that life can be more than just getting through the day. I don't know what happens when this is over, but I know I want to see it through with you. And that means fighting for this place because this place is yours. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed his hands. I've felt it too, she whispered. I told myself I was foolish, that you were just a good man doing a kind thing, and I shouldn't read more into it. But Jonas, she stopped, swallowed. I haven't let myself hope for things like this in a long time. Then hope, Jonas said. Hope that we'll win this fight. Hope that we'll build something worth keeping. Hope that maybe two people who've been alone too long found each other when they needed it most. He leaned forward and kissed her. Gentle and tentative, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Clara didn't pull away. She kissed him back. Her hands coming up to touch his face, and for a moment, the threat of eviction and violence faded into the background when they finally separated. Clara was crying and smiling at the same time. You're a strange man, Jonas Hale, coming into my life like this, making me believe things might actually work out. Maybe they will, Jonas said. And if they don't, at least we'll have tried together. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Clara asked Jonas to bring her something from the trunk. He retrieved a small wooden box, fire-scarred but intact. Clara opened it carefully and pulled out a music box, brass and wood, dented and blackened in places but still functional. "This was my mother's," Clara said. She wound the key, and a melody filled the cabin, haunting and beautiful, a little off-key from the damage but still recognizable. "It's the only thing I managed to save from the fire. Everything else burned." Jonas listened to the music, watching the way Clara's fingers traced the burned edges of the box. "My father gave this to my mother on their wedding day," Clara continued. "She played it every evening before bed. After she died in the fire, I kept it because," her voice broke, "because it reminded me that beautiful things can survive even when everything around them burns." "You survived," Jonas said gently. "I did. But sometimes I wonder if I really lived or if I just existed." Clara looked up at him. "Until you came. Until someone finally saw me as more than just the crippled woman in the cabin everyone forgot about." Jonas moved to sit beside her, taking her hand. "You're so much more than that. You're the strongest person I've ever met." They sat together as the music box played, the melody winding down slowly until it faded into silence. Outside, night settled over the mountains, bringing cold and darkness and the distant howl of a coyote. But inside the cabin, there was warmth and hope and the beginning of something neither of them had thought they'd find again. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Timothy arrived early, out of breath from running up the trail. "Mr. Hale, Miss Clara," he called even before reaching the porch. "Something happened in town. Something big." Jonas came out of the shed where he'd been sharpening tools. "Slow down, son. What's wrong?" Timothy bent over, hands on his knees, catching his breath. "There was a collapse at the Columbine mine last night. Part of the main shaft caved in. 3 men are trapped, including my father," Clara gasped. "Is he?" "They don't know yet. They're trying to dig them out, but Mr. Wade—" Timothy's face twisted with anger. "Mr. Wade won't send for help from the other mines. He says it would cost too much, shut down production too long. He's only got 6 men digging when there should be 20. Jonas felt that rage again, colder now and more focused. "Where's the mine?" "North Ridge, about 5 miles up the canyon road." Jonas was already moving, grabbing his rifle and a coil of rope from the shed. "I'm going to help." "Jonas, wait," Clara called. "If Wade's men are there, I don't care who's there. There are men trapped underground. That's all that matters." He turned to Timothy. "Stay here with Clara, keep watch. If anyone comes, anyone at all, you fire this pistol 3 times. He handed the boy an old revolver from his pack. "Can you do that?" Timothy nodded, his face pale but determined. Jonas saddled Sadie and rode hard for the mine, following Timothy's directions through increasingly rough terrain. He could hear the mine before he saw it, the sound of men shouting, of picks hitting rock, of timber creaking under strain. The Columbine mine entrance was a black mouth in the side of the mountain, supported by timbers that looked older than they should be. Outside, 6 men were working in shifts, 2 digging while 4 rested. They were exhausted, covered in rock dust, their hands bleeding. Dutch Keller stood to one side, watching. When he saw Jonas, his face darkened. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to help," Jonas said simply. He dismounted and walked toward the mine entrance. Dutch stepped in front of him. "We don't need your help." Jonas looked past him at the men digging, at their exhaustion, at the slow progress they were making. "Those men do. How long have they been trapped?" 12 hours. "And if you think Wade's going to thank you for showing up—" "I don't care what Wade thinks," Jonas interrupted. "I care about getting those men out alive." He pushed past Dutch and approached the dig site. The men looked up at him with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. "I've worked mines before," Jonas said. "Colorado, Nevada. I know shoring and I know cave-ins." "Let me help," one of the men, older with a grey beard, nodded. "We could use the hands. Wade only gave us 6 men and told us to make it work." Jonas stripped off his shirt and grabbed a pick. The work was brutal. swinging the pick until his shoulders screamed, hauling rock and timber, all while worrying that the unstable shaft might collapse further at any moment. But Jonas worked alongside the miners without complaint, and slowly, grudgingly, they began to accept him. Dutch watched from a distance, his face unreadable. Jonas knew he was probably sending word to Wade about what was happening, but he didn't care. Right now, all that mattered was the sound of picks hitting rock and the hope that they'd reach the trapped men before it was too late. As the sun climbed toward noon, they broke through. A cheer went up as fresh air rushed into the collapsed section. All three men were alive, injured but alive. Timothy's father was among them, his leg broken but his spirit intact. As they brought the men out into daylight, Jonas caught sight of someone new arriving, a well-dressed man on a fine horse, watching everything with calculating eyes. This had to be Garrett Wade himself. Wade was younger than Jonas expected, maybe 50, with silver at his temples and the kind of confident bearing that came from never being told no. He surveyed the scene with the cool assessment of a man evaluating property, not people. His eyes settled on Jonas, recognition flickering across his face. Then he smiled, cold and sharp as a knife. The battle lines had been drawn. And Garrett Wade had just gotten his first real look at the man who was refusing to back down. 3 days before the scheduled eviction hearing, Jonas was repairing a weak board on the porch when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A crack, then a groan of stressed wood. He looked up just as the board he was standing on gave way, sending him crashing through to the ground beneath the porch. Pain exploded through his left ankle. Jonas bit back a curse, trying to pull himself free, but the board had trapped his foot at an awkward angle, and when he tried to move it, agony shot up his leg. "Jonas?" Clara's voice came from inside. "What was that noise?" "Stay inside," Jonas called, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm fine." He wasn't fine. He could see where the board had been sawed, not all the way through, but enough to weaken it. This wasn't an accident. This was Dutch Keller making good on Wade's threats. Clara appeared in the doorway, took one look at Jonas, trapped beneath the porch, and her face went pale. "Don't move. I'm coming. Clara, you can't..." But she was already lowering herself from the wheelchair onto the porch floor, then sliding herself to the edge. With practiced movements born of 5 years of adaptation, she maneuvered down the steps on her backside, pulling herself across the ground to where Jonas lay trapped. "Show me where it hurts," she said. "All business. My ankle. It's caught." Jonas tried again to pull free, and this time he couldn't stop the groan of pain. Clara examined the situation, her hands moving quickly and competently. "The board's pinching your foot. I need to lift it while you pull back. Ready?" "Clara, you can't lift..." "I said ready?" Her voice was sharp, focused. This was the woman who'd survived 5 years alone, and Jonas suddenly remembered that survival required more than just waiting for help. "Ready," he said. Clara braced herself and lifted with arms made strong from years of wheeling herself around, years of hauling water and chopping vegetables and doing everything a person did to stay alive. The board lifted just enough. Jonas pulled his foot free, then immediately grabbed Clara to steady her as she lost her balance. They ended up on the ground together, breathing hard. Jonas's ankle throbbed, but he could move his toes, likely sprained, not broken. "That board was cut," Clara said, examining it. "Someone did this deliberately." Wade sending another message. Jonas tried to stand, but pain shot through his ankle. "Damn it! We need to splint that and get ice from the stream." Clara was already pulling herself back toward the cabin. "And we need to be more careful. If they're willing to sabotage the porch, they'll try other things." Jonas watched her drag herself up the steps with just her arms, her useless legs trailing behind, and felt a fierce pride mixed with anger. She shouldn't have to fight like this. Neither of them should. But Wade had made it clear he'd use any means necessary to drive them off this land. With Clara's help, Jonas got his ankle wrapped and elevated. The swelling was bad, and he knew he'd be limited in his mobility for at least a few days, right before the hearing. Convenient timing for Wade. That night, as Jonas lay on his bedroll with his throbbing ankle propped up, unable to sleep, he noticed Clara was awake too. sitting in her wheelchair by the window looking out at the moonlit forest. "Can't sleep?" he asked. Clara turned toward him. "I keep thinking about the hearing, about what we're going to say, how we're going to convince a judge that I deserve to stay here. And then I think about Wade's men sabotaging the porch, and I wonder what else they might do before then. We'll be careful. Keep watch. Timothy's father and the other miners said they'd check on us daily." "It's not enough." Clara wheeled herself closer. "Jonas, I need to tell you something. About the fire." Jonas pushed himself up to sitting, ignoring the complaint from his ankle. "What about it?" "I told you my brother Daniel attacked me after the fire, that my family left me here. But I didn't tell you everything." Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "The fire wasn't an accident. Daniel started it." Jonas felt his blood go cold. "What? He was drunk." He and Mother had argued earlier that evening about money, about Daniel's gambling debts. He stormed out, came back hours later even drunker. I saw him from my window, saw him throw something at the cabin wall. At first I didn't understand what it was. Then I smelled the kerosene. Clara, by the time I realized what was happening, the wall was already burning. I tried to wake everyone, but the fire spread so fast. Mother went back for something, I never knew what. And then, her voice broke, and then Daniel pulled me out, and he was crying, saying he was sorry, saying he didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. But Mother was dead, and my legs were crushed, and our whole life was destroyed. Did your father know? He suspected. We never talked about it directly, but I think that's why he couldn't look at me. Because I knew. Because every time he saw me, he saw what Daniel had done, and he couldn't face it. So when Wade offered them a way out, a way to start over somewhere new without the reminder of that night, they took it, all of them. Even Daniel. Jonas moved to sit beside her, wincing as his ankle protested. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" "Daniel should have faced justice for what he did, because he was my brother. Because despite everything, I couldn't." Clara's voice hardened. "No, that's a lie. I could have. I should have. I didn't because I was scared. Because I thought if I told, my father would hate me even more. That they'd all blame me for destroying the family completely." She looked at Jonas with eyes full of old pain and new determination. "But I'm done being scared. I'm done protecting people who hurt me. Tomorrow, I'm going to Judge Whitfield, and I'm going to tell him everything. About the fire, about Daniel, about how Wade paid my family to abandon me here. Because if we're going to fight this, we're going to fight with the whole truth." Jonas took her hand. "That's going to be hard. Admitting all of that in public, I know. But you were right before. The hardest battles are against the voices in our own heads. I've been letting shame and fear control me for 5 years. It's time to stop." The next morning, despite his injured ankle, Jonas saddled Sadie and helped Clara onto the mule behind him. They rode into town together, slowly, carefully, and went straight to Judge Whitfield's small cabin. The old judge listened to Clara's full story without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This changes things," he said finally. "If we can prove your family abandoned you here as part of an agreement with Wade, and if we can show that you've maintained continuous residence while Wade ignored the property, we have a much stronger case than I thought. But we still need to prove Wade knew I was here," Clara said. "That he deliberately left me to die, maybe, or at least to suffer." Judge Whitfield pulled out a document from a stack on his desk. "I've been doing some research. Wade purchased this property and 5 others in the same auction. He took possession of the other 5 immediately, hired men to clear them, posted notices. But this property, he did nothing. For 5 years, nothing. That suggests he knew someone was living here. Why would he wait so long to evict her?" Jonas asked. "Because he didn't need the land yet. His railroad plans are recent, within the last 6 months. Before that, it was just one more parcel in his collection. But now that the railroad is coming, every piece of his route matters. He can't have a squatter, especially one with a potential legal claim, blocking his path." The judge looked at Clara. "If you're willing to testify about everything, the fire, your family's deal with Wade, your 5 years of survival, we can make this ugly for him. We can force him to admit he knowingly abandoned you on property he owned, that he profited from your family's cruelty. It won't be easy, and it will be painful, but it might be enough to win." Clara lifted her chin. "I'll do it. Whatever it takes." As they were leaving the judge's cabin, Jonas noticed someone watching them from across the street. Dutch Keller, leaning against a post, his eyes cold and calculating. He'd heard them arrive, knew they'd been meeting with the judge. Wade would know everything by sunset. The attack came that night. Jonas woke to the sound of breaking glass. He grabbed his rifle and rolled to his feet, his injured ankle screaming in protest. Flames were already licking up the outside wall where someone had thrown a torch through the window. "Clara!" Jonas shouted, moving toward her bed. She was already awake, already transferring herself to her wheelchair with frantic speed. "The door!" she gasped. "We have to get out." But when Jonas tried the door, it wouldn't budge. Someone had barred it from outside. They were trapped, and the fire was spreading fast, just like the fire 5 years ago that had taken Clara's mother and her legs. "The back window," Jonas said, coughing as smoke filled the cabin. "Can you fit through it?" "I don't know." "Jonas, your ankle." "Move!" Jonas didn't give her time to argue. He wheeled her to the back window, smashed out the remaining glass with his rifle butt, and lifted her bodily from the chair. She was lighter than he expected, wasted from 5 years of minimal nutrition, but still she fought him. "The trunk!" she cried. "My mother's things." "No time." Jonas pushed her through the window, lowering her as gently as he could to the ground outside. Then he grabbed what he could, his rifle, the leather pouch with their documents, Clara's fire-scarred music box, and threw them through the window before climbing out himself. His ankle gave out when he hit the ground, and Jonas went down hard. Clara was already crawling away from the cabin, pulling herself across the ground with her arms. Jonas grabbed the back of her nightdress and helped haul her away from the burning building. They made it to the tree line just as the roof collapsed, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Jonas held Clara as she sobbed. For the cabin, for her mother's things lost twice now, for everything they'd fought to save going up in flames. "I'm sorry," Jonas said, his voice raw from smoke and emotion. "I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault," Clara choked out. "It's Wade. It's always been Wade." They sat there watching the cabin burn, listening to the crackle and roar of hungry flames, until they heard horses approaching. Jonas tensed, raising his rifle, but it was Marcus Brennan and 3 other miners, arriving at a gallop. "We saw the smoke," Marcus said, dismounting. "Are you both all right?" "We're alive," Jonas said. "But everything else, don't worry about the cabin right now. We need to get you both to safety." Marcus and another miner lifted Clara carefully. "You'll stay with me tonight, both of you. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." As they rode away from the burning cabin, Jonas behind Marcus, Clara with another miner, Jonas looked back at the flames consuming the place they'd fought so hard to save. Wade had made his move. He'd tried to burn them out, probably hoping it would look like an accident, hoping they'd be too scared or too injured to continue the fight. But as Jonas felt Clara's hand find his in the darkness, as he saw the determination still burning in her eyes despite the tears on her face, he knew Wade had miscalculated. They weren't giving up. They were just getting started. And now, with a deliberate arson attempt added to their testimony, with witnesses who'd seen them fleeing the burning cabin, their case had just gotten a lot stronger. Wade had wanted to end this fight. Instead, he'd given them the ammunition they needed to win it. The hearing was in 2 days, and Jonas Hale intended to make sure Garrett Wade regretted every threat he'd ever made, every cruel thing he'd ever done. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The church hall was packed when they arrived. Word had spread through Willow Creek about the hearing, and it seemed half the town had come to watch. Jonas helped Clara from the wagon and into her wheelchair, the borrowed one, since her handmade chair had burned with the cabin. She wore Sarah's dress and held her head high. Though Jonas could see the tension in her shoulders, Garrett Wade sat at the front with his lawyer, Silas Crane, and 2 other attorneys Jonas didn't recognize. Wade looked confident, almost bored, like this hearing was a minor inconvenience on his way to more important business. When his eyes met Jonas's, he smiled, cold and certain of victory. Judge Morrison was a stern-looking man in his 60s, with iron-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. He called the court to order and asked both sides to present their opening statements. Silas Crane stood first. "Your Honor, this is a simple case of property rights. Mr. Wade legally purchased this land at a county tax auction 6 months ago. He holds the deed, registered and filed. The respondent, Miss Byrne, has no legal claim to the property. She's been squatting there since her family abandoned the land 5 years ago. Mr. Wade has been generous, offering financial compensation for Miss Byrne to relocate peacefully. Instead, she's chosen to fight a legal battle she cannot win, wasting this court's time and resources." Silas sat down, looking satisfied. Judge Whitfield stood slowly, leaning on his walking stick. "Your Honor, this is not a simple case of property rights. This is a case about justice, about abuse of power, and about a woman who survived 5 years alone through sheer will and determination, only to be threatened, terrorized, and finally burned out of her home by a man who thinks his money puts him above the law." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Wade's face remained impassive, but Jonas saw his jaw tighten. Judge Whitfield continued, "We will show that Miss Byrne has a legitimate homestead claim to the property based on 5 years of continuous residence and improvement. We will show that Mr. Wade knew she was living there and deliberately ignored her presence until it became convenient to remove her. And we will show that when legal means proved too slow, Mr. Wade resorted to arson and attempted murder to achieve his goals." "Those are serious accusations," Judge Morrison said. "I hope you have evidence to support them." "We do, Your Honor. Substantial evidence." The judge nodded. "Very well, Mr. Crane, present your case." The next hour was brutal. Crane called witnesses who testified to Wade's legitimate purchase of the property, to Clara's family's unpaid taxes, to the proper legal procedures followed at the auction. He presented the deed, the tax records, everything showing Wade's ironclad legal claim to the land. Then he called Clara to the stand. Jonas helped her wheel up to the witness chair. She lifted herself from the wheelchair to the seat with practiced movements, and Jonas saw several people in the courtroom look away, uncomfortable with her disability. But Clara sat straight, her hands folded in her lap, and met Crane's eyes without flinching. "Miss Byrne," Crane began with false gentleness, "you've been living on Mr. Wade's property for 5 years without permission, without paying rent, without any legal right to be there. Is that correct?" "I've been living on land I believed belonged to my family," Clara said steadily. "Land where I survived after being abandoned. Land where I built a life. But you knew your family no longer owned the land, didn't you? You knew they'd lost it to taxes. I knew they'd made some arrangement with Mr. Wade. I didn't know the details. Because you were abandoned, correct? Your family left you behind when they went west." Crane's voice dripped with sympathy that Jonas knew was calculated. "That must have been difficult. Perhaps it affected your judgment, made you cling to something that wasn't really yours." "Objection," Judge Whitfield called. "Counsel is making assumptions about my client's mental state." "Sustained," Judge Morrison said. "Mr. Crane, stick to the facts," Crane smiled. "Of course. Miss Byrne, isn't it true that you're unable to work in any meaningful capacity due to your condition? That you've been dependent on charity from townspeople for survival?" Clara's face flushed. "I work. I sew. I preserve food. I trade my skills for supplies. I'm not a charity case, but you can't maintain property, can you? You can't make repairs, clear land, improve the structures. Under homestead law, an applicant must show they can actively maintain and improve the land. How can you do that from a wheelchair?" Jonas felt rage building in his chest. Crane was attacking Clara's disability, making it seem like her limitations invalidated her claim to the life she'd built. But Clara didn't waver. "I've maintained that property for 5 years. I've survived blizzards and droughts. I've kept myself alive when everyone, including my own family, expected me to die. If that's not improvement, if that's not proof of my ability to maintain land, then I don't know what is. Miss Byrne, I'm not finished." Clara's voice rose, strong and clear. "You want to know about improvement? I'll tell you. I learned to identify every edible plant within a mile of that cabin. I set snare lines that kept me fed through winters that would have killed someone weaker. I preserved food, collected water, mended clothes, and did everything a person needs to do to survive. All without legs, all without help for years. And then Jonas came, and together we repaired the roof, fixed the porch, built a woodshed. We made that place better than it had been in a decade. So don't you dare tell me I can't maintain property. The courtroom was silent. Even Crane looked momentarily thrown. He recovered quickly, very inspiring. But the fact remains that you have no legal claim to the property. Mr. Wade does. Now, about the fire 2 nights ago that your client ordered, Clara interrupted. To burn us out, to murder us, if we didn't escape in time. That's a serious accusation. Do you have any proof? Yes, Judge Whitfield said, standing. We do. Defense calls Dutch Keller to the stand. The courtroom erupted in whispers as Dutch was led in. Wade's face went pale, then red with fury. He leaned over to whisper urgently to Crane, but the lawyer waved him off, watching Dutch with calculating eyes. Dutch took the stand and was sworn in. He looked at Wade once, then looked away. Mr. Keller, Judge Whitfield began, you work for Garrett Wade, is that correct? I did, not anymore. And what was your position? Foreman. I handled situations that required, Dutch paused, physical persuasion. Meaning you threatened people? Intimidated them? Yes, sir. When Mr. Wade wanted someone to leave land he'd purchased, or pay debts they owed, or stop asking inconvenient questions, I made it happen. And did Mr. Wade give you instructions regarding Miss Byrne and Mr. Hale? Dutch nodded. He told me to scare them off. Cut fence lines, poison the well, make them think twice about staying. Then when that didn't work, he told me to burn the cabin, make it look like an accident. Did he say anything about ensuring Miss Byrne and Mr. Hale's safety during this arson? Dutch's face was grim. He said if they didn't make it out, that would solve the problem permanently. The courtroom exploded. Judge Morrison banged his gavel for order. Wade was on his feet, his face purple with rage. This is a lie. Your Honor, this man was fired for theft. He's clearly trying to get revenge by making false accusations. Sit down, Mr. Wade, Judge Morrison said coldly. You'll have your chance to respond. Continue, Mr. Whitfield. Judge Whitfield approached Dutch. How long have you worked for Mr. Wade? 15 years. And in that time, how many other properties has he acquired through similar methods? Objection, Crane shouted. Mr. Wade is not on trial here. Your Honor, Whitfield said calmly, this goes to pattern of behavior. If Mr. Wade has used illegal means to acquire property before, it's relevant to whether he did so in this case. Judge Morrison considered. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mr. Keller. Dutch took a breath. At least a dozen properties that I know of. Sometimes he'd use legal pressure, calling in debts at strategic times, raising rents until people couldn't pay. Other times he'd use threats. And twice before, he ordered buildings burned when the owners wouldn't sell. Did anyone die in those fires? No, sir. But that was luck more than planning. Judge Whitfield nodded. Thank you. No further questions. Crane stood for cross-examination, but there was little he could do to shake Dutch's testimony. The man had nothing left to lose. He'd already destroyed his relationship with Wade, and he clearly wanted absolution for the things he'd done. When Dutch stepped down, Judge Whitfield called Timothy to the stand. The boy testified about bringing Clara supplies for 3 years, about knowing she was alone and trying to help. Then Sarah's sister, the schoolteacher, testified that she'd seen Timothy making regular trips up the mountain and knew where he was going. Marcus Brennan testified about the mine collapse, about Jonas helping save 3 men when Wade wouldn't send adequate resources. Other miners testified about Wade's cruelty, his disregard for safety, his habit of crushing anyone who opposed him. Then Jonas took the stand. Crane approached him with barely concealed hostility. Mr. Hale, you're a drifter, aren't you? No permanent home, no family, no ties to any community. I was a drifter, Jonas said, until I came to Willow Creek. And you just happened to purchase this property you claim you didn't know Mr. Wade had already acquired, for $5. That's correct. Awfully convenient. Some might say you and Miss Byrne cooked up this scheme together to defraud Mr. Wade. Some might say a lot of foolish things, Jonas replied. Doesn't make them true. Crane's face reddened. You expect this court to believe you spent your last $5 on property without thoroughly investigating the title? I expect this court to believe that a man tired of running found a place to stop, found a woman worth standing beside, and decided to fight when powerful people tried to push them around. That's what happened. Nothing more, nothing less. How touching. Tell me, Mr. Hale, what do you get out of this? If Miss Byrne wins her homestead claim, the property will be in her name, not yours. You'll have nothing. Jonas looked at Clara, sitting in her wheelchair by the defense table, and smiled. I'll have everything that matters. The testimony concluded near sunset. Judge Morrison called for closing arguments. Crane went first, arguing that emotions and sympathy had no place in a courtroom, that the law was clear, that Wade's ownership was legitimate, regardless of what methods he may or may not have used to protect his property. Judge Whitfield's closing was simple and powerful. Your Honor, this case is about whether the law exists to protect the powerful or to serve justice. Mr. Wade may have a deed to the land surrounding Miss Byrne's cabin, but he does not have a claim to the 5-acre parcel where her cabin stood, a parcel that, according to the 1867 survey, was never properly conveyed. Miss Byrne has occupied that parcel for 5 continuous years. She has improved it, maintained it, and survived on it. Under territorial homestead law, she has a legitimate claim. And if Mr. Wade used arson and attempted murder to drive her off, as the evidence clearly shows, then he has forfeited any moral or legal right to that property. The law is meant to protect people, not property. And Miss Byrne is a person who deserves protection. Judge Morrison looked out at the packed courtroom. This case requires careful consideration. I'll issue my ruling tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Court is adjourned. As they left the church hall, Jonas felt Clara's hand find his. They'd done everything they could. The rest was up to Judge Morrison, and whether he believed justice mattered more than power. The night before the ruling, Jonas couldn't sleep. He lay on a pallet on Marcus's floor, listening to the house settle around him, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Clara was in the other room, sharing the bed with Martha, and he could hear her restless movements through the thin walls. She couldn't sleep either. Finally, near midnight, Jonas got up and made his way to the kitchen. He found Clara already there, sitting in her wheelchair by the window, looking out at the moonlit mountains. Couldn't sleep? He asked quietly. Too many thoughts. Clara turned to him. Jonas, what if we lose? What if Judge Morrison rules for Wade despite everything? Jonas sat down beside her. Then we pick up and start over together. That's what matters. But you'd lose everything. I'd lose a piece of land and a burned-down cabin. I wouldn't lose you. Jonas took her hand. Clara, I've lost everything that mattered once before. My wife, my daughter, my home. I spent 30 years running from that loss, thinking if I never cared about anything again, I'd never have to feel that pain. But I learned something these past weeks. The pain of loss is terrible, yes. But the emptiness of never caring, that's worse. You taught me that. You taught me it's better to love and risk losing than to spend your life protected but alone. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I'm scared. Of hoping too much. Of believing this might work out. I know. But hope is the only thing that's kept either of us alive this long. Don't give up on it now. They sat together in the darkness, watching the moon track across the sky until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon. Then they prepared for the day that would decide their future. The church hall was even more crowded than the day before. It seemed like everyone in Willow Creek and half the county had come to hear the verdict. Jonas helped Clara into position at the front, then sat beside her, their hands clasped on the armrest of her wheelchair. Garrett Wade sat across the aisle with his lawyers, his face carefully neutral. But Jonas could see the tension in his shoulders, the white knuckles where his hands gripped his chair. Wade wasn't as confident as he wanted everyone to believe. At 9 o'clock exactly, Judge Morrison entered. Everyone stood. Even Clara struggled to her feet, using the chair arms for support, refusing to be the only one sitting when the judge walked in. "Please be seated," Judge Morrison said. He arranged his papers carefully before looking up at the packed courtroom. "This has been one of the most complex and emotionally charged cases I've presided over in 30 years on the bench. The law is rarely simple, but it should always serve justice. With that principle in mind, I'm ready to issue my ruling." The room was so quiet Jonas could hear his own heartbeat. First, regarding the property ownership, Mr. Wade's attorneys have presented a legitimate deed to a parcel of land purchased at tax auction. However, the defense has shown convincingly that there's a discrepancy between the boundaries described in Mr. Wade's deed and the boundaries shown in the original 1867 survey. The 5-acre parcel on which Miss Byrne's cabin stood appears to be a surveying error, land that was never properly conveyed to anyone and thus remained. Unclaimed territorial land, Jonas felt Clara's hand tighten in, is under territorial homestead law. Judge Morrison continued, "Any person who occupies and improves unclaimed land for 5 continuous years may file a claim to that land. Miss Byrne has provided ample evidence of her continuous residence on this property. She has survived, maintained, and improved the land to the best of her abilities. The testimony of multiple witnesses confirms this. Therefore, I'm ruling that Miss Byrne has a valid homestead claim to the 5-acre parcel in question." A cheer went up from the crowd. Wade shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. That woman is a squatter, and this court is—" "Sit down, Mr. Wade," Judge Morrison said icily. "I'm not finished." Wade sat, his face mottled with rage. "Now, regarding the arson charges, Mr. Dutch Keller's testimony was compelling and corroborated by the testimony of the miners who witnessed Miss Byrne and Mr. Hale fleeing the burning cabin. Based on this evidence, I'm referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for criminal investigation. If the evidence supports charges of arson and attempted murder, Mr. Wade will face trial." The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! I will clear this courtroom if necessary." When quiet was restored, the judge continued. "There's one final matter. Mr. Wade, you've built an empire in Willow Creek through a combination of legitimate business and, according to the testimony we've heard, intimidation and violence. You've operated under the assumption that your wealth and influence put you above the law. This court is here to tell you that assumption is incorrect." Wade's face had gone pale. "I'm ordering a full audit of all property acquisitions you've made in the past 10 years. Any properties acquired through fraudulent means, intimidation or violence will be subject to seizure and returned to their rightful owners. You will also pay Miss Byrne compensation in the amount of $5,000 for the destruction of her cabin and possessions, to be used for rebuilding. And you will pay Mr. Hale $5, Judge Morrison's lips twitched slightly, for the return of his fraudulent purchase. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Wade looked like he might explode. "Finally," Judge Morrison said, "I'm issuing a restraining order. Mr. Wade, you and any employees or associates acting on your behalf are forbidden from coming within 1 mile of Miss Byrne's property. Any violation will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. Do you understand?" Wade's lawyer had to nudge him before he answered through clenched teeth. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then this court is adjourned." Judge Morrison banged his gavel one final time. The courtroom exploded into celebration. Marcus and the other miners were cheering. Timothy was crying and laughing at the same time. Martha was hugging anyone within reach. And Clara sat perfectly still, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd just heard. Jonas knelt in front of her wheelchair. "We won." "You won." Clara's face crumpled, and she pulled Jonas into a fierce embrace, sobbing into his shoulder. Not tears of sadness, but of relief and joy and exhaustion. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," Jonas corrected. "You survived. You fought. You refused to give up." Judge Whitfield approached them, his old face creased with a smile. "Congratulations, Miss Byrne. That property is legally yours now. No one can take it from you." "Thank you," Clara managed. Thank you so much. Don't thank me. Thank your courage. And your stubbornness. The judge winked at Jonas. And thank this man for showing up when you needed him most. As they made their way out of the church hall, Jonas noticed Garrett Wade standing by his carriage, watching them with eyes full of cold fury. Dutch Keller had essentially destroyed Wade's reputation and opened him up to criminal charges. The town that had feared him now saw him as a criminal, not a captain of industry. Wade caught Jonas's eye and leaned in close as they passed. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "I have lawyers, influence, money. You may have won today, but I'll find a way to—" "Mr. Wade," Clara's voice cut through his threats. She'd wheeled herself to face him directly. "You tried to burn us out. You tried to kill us. You tried to make me disappear because I was inconvenient. But I'm still here, and I'll still be here long after you're forgotten. That's what survival looks like. Remember it." She wheeled away, leaving Wade staring after her, for once at a loss for words. Outside, in the afternoon sunlight, the celebration continued. Someone had brought whiskey, and the miners were passing a bottle around. Sarah had closed the store and come to congratulate. Clara, even the sheriff, who'd been conspicuously absent during the hearing, showed up to shake Jonas's hand and mutter something about justice being served. Timothy pulled Jonas aside. "Mr. Hale, my father wanted me to tell you something. He's offering you a job at the mine, supervisor position. Says we need men who care more about safety than profit." Jonas looked over at where Clara was surrounded by well-wishers, her face glowing with happiness and relief. "Tell your father I appreciate the offer, but I have a cabin to rebuild. After that, well, we'll see." Timothy grinned. "I figured you'd say that. I already volunteered to help with the rebuilding. So did a bunch of the other miners. Thank you, son. That means more than you know." As the celebration wound down, Marcus loaded Clara and Jonas into his wagon for the ride back to his house. But Clara asked him to stop at the property first. "I want to see it," she said. "I need to see what's left." They rode up the familiar trail, past the stream where Jonas had first watered Sadie, past the wildflowers that had been blooming when he arrived all those weeks ago. The clearing where the cabin had stood was a blackened scar, the stone chimney rising from the ashes like a monument to what had been. Jonas helped Clara from the wagon and into her wheelchair, then pushed her as close to the ruins as they could safely get. They sat there in silence, looking at the devastation. "I know it looks bad," Jonas said finally, "but the chimney's still standing. The foundation's intact. We can rebuild." "I know." Clara reached back and took his hand. "And this time we'll build it together. Build it stronger. Build it into something that can't be burned down. Not by fire, not by threats, not by anyone." She pulled out the fire-scarred music box, the one Timothy had rescued from the ruins. She wound the key, and despite the damage, despite everything it had been through, it played. The melody was warped and off-key, but it played. "My mother used to say that beautiful things can survive even when everything around them burns," Clara said softly. "I didn't really understand what she meant until now. She wasn't just talking about things. She was talking about people, about love, about hope." Jonas moved to kneel beside her wheelchair, looking up into her eyes. "Clara Byrne, I came to this mountain with nothing but $5 and a plan to fade away. Instead, I found you, and you saved me. Not from anything dramatic, but from the slow death of not caring whether I lived or not. You taught me how to care again, how to fight, how to hope." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a ring he'd made from bent wire and a piece of polished stone he'd found by the stream. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. "I know this isn't fancy. I know we'll be starting over from nothing, living in Marcus's spare room while we rebuild. But I also know I want to spend every day for the rest of my life with you. So I'm asking, will you marry me?" Clara looked at the simple ring, then at Jonas, and her face transformed with joy. Yes, of course, yes." Jonas slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed there in the ashes of the old cabin, making promises for the future they'd build together. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Jonas thought about how strange life could be. He'd come here to die, and instead he'd found a reason to live. He'd lost a $5 cabin, and instead he'd gained everything that mattered. The fight was over. The victory was won. And now the real work began, the work of building a life, a home, a future with the woman he loved. It wouldn't be easy. There would be hard days ahead, long hours of labor, setbacks and struggles. But they'd face it all together, and that made every challenge bearable. Jonas Hale had finally stopped running. And in stopping, he'd found what he'd been searching for all along, a place to belong. A person to love, and a reason to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. The cursed cabin was gone, but the curse had been broken. And in its place, something new and beautiful was about to rise. 3 months had passed since the hearing, and autumn had painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Jonas stood on what would be the new porch, hammer in hand, watching the sun rise over the peaks. The cabin wasn't finished yet, but it was getting close. This one was bigger than the old cabin, room for a proper bedroom, a larger main room, and a workshop where Clara could do her sewing without cramping the living space. The miners had helped with the framing, working weekends and evenings. Timothy and his father had built the stone foundation. Sarah had donated fabric for curtains. Judge Whitfield had contributed a rocking chair that had belonged to his late wife. The whole town, it seemed, wanted to be part of rebuilding what Wade had tried to destroy. Jonas heard wheels on wood, the new ramp he'd built, so Clara could wheel herself in and out easily. She appeared in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're up early," she said, handing him a cup. "Couldn't sleep." "Too excited." Jonas gestured at the cabin. "Another week, maybe 2, and we can move in." "It's beautiful," Clara said, and she wasn't just talking about the cabin. Her eyes took in the whole scene, the mountains, the forest, the clearing they'd worked so hard to keep. "Thank you for all of this. We built it together," Jonas reminded her. He set down his hammer and sat beside her on the edge of the porch, their legs dangling over the side. Well, his legs dangling. Clara's were still and straight. But Jonas had learned that her strength had nothing to do with whether her legs worked. They'd been married a month ago, in a simple ceremony at the church, with half of Willow Creek in attendance. Clara had worn a dress Martha made, and Jonas had worn his best shirt, the only one without patches. Judge Morrison had performed the ceremony, seeming pleased to deliver something joyful after the contentious hearing. Garrett Wade hadn't attended. He'd been too busy dealing with the territorial prosecutor's investigation and the audit of his property holdings. 3 of his acquisitions had already been overturned, returned to families he'd cheated. More were pending. His empire was crumbling, and with it, his grip on Willow Creek. Dutch Keller had testified against Wade in exchange for reduced charges. He'd served 6 months for his role in the arson, but the judge had shown him leniency for coming forward. Jonas had even offered him work on the cabin rebuild, a chance to make amends. Dutch had accepted gratefully, working harder than anyone to prove he could be more than Wade's enforcer. "I've been thinking," Clara said, sipping her coffee, "about what to do with all this space. The new cabin's bigger than we need, really. What are you thinking? There are other women like me. Women who've been left behind, forgotten, told they're not worth the trouble. Women with disabilities who don't have families to care for them. What if—" Clara paused, gathering her thoughts. "What if we use the space to help them? Not permanently, just until they can find their feet. Teach them the skills I learned for survival. Show them they're stronger than the world tells them they are." Jonas looked at his wife, this remarkable woman who'd survived abandonment and abuse and still had enough compassion left to want to help others. "I think that's a beautiful idea. We'll need to add on another room or 2, but we can manage it. You don't think I'm being foolish? Taking on more than we can handle? I think you're being exactly who you are, someone who survived so she could help others survive too. That's not foolish. That's heroic." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "We make a good team, don't we?" "The best," Jonas agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the forest wake up around them. A deer picked its way delicately through the trees. A hawk circled overhead, riding the morning thermals. The creek burbled in the distance, its voice constant and soothing. This was peace, Jonas thought. Real peace, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose. Not running from the past, but building toward the future. Jonas. Clara's voice pulled him from his reverie. Do you ever regret it? Spending your last $5 on that cabin. Everything that came after? Jonas thought about the question seriously. He thought about the threats and the fire, the court battle and the months of uncertainty. He thought about his injured ankle and the hard labor of rebuilding. He thought about taking on responsibility after years of drifting free. Not for a second, he said finally. That $5 bought me the best thing I could have asked for, a second chance. A chance to matter again, a chance to love and be loved. A chance to build something that lasts. He turned to look at Clara. What about you? Do you regret that I stayed? That I complicated your life? Clara smiled, that warm, genuine smile that still made Jonas's heart skip. You didn't complicate my life. You gave me one. There's a difference. Movement on the trail caught their attention. Timothy riding up on the horse Marcus had given him for his 14th birthday. The boy had grown taller over the summer, his voice deepening, his shoulders broadening. He spent more time with his father now, working the mines together, but he still came up the mountain several times a week to check on Jonas and Clara. Morning, Timothy called, dismounting. I brought supplies from Sarah's store and some news. Good news or bad news? Jonas asked. Depends on your perspective. Wade's leaving Willow Creek, selling off what's left of his holdings and heading east. Some say he's going back to Boston, where his family's from. Others say he's just running before more of his crimes come to light. Clara absorbed this information quietly. I should feel happy about that. But mostly I just feel sad for him. All that power and money, and in the end, he has nothing that matters. No one who loves him, no legacy except the harm he did. That's the difference between you and him, Jonas said. You learned that people matter more than property. He never did. Timothy unloaded the supplies, flour, sugar, salt, and a package from Sarah marked for Clara. Inside was a bolt of beautiful fabric and a note, for the new curtains. Consider it a housewarming gift. Love, Sarah. After Timothy left, Jonas and Clara spent the day working on the cabin. Clara couldn't do the heavy lifting, but she could measure and mark, hold boards steady, keep track of supplies. They worked well together, falling into an easy rhythm that came from spending so much time in each other's company. Late in the afternoon, Marcus and Martha arrived with a wagon full of furniture they'd been storing, a table and chairs donated by families in town, a dresser from the church's charity collection, blankets and dishes and all the small necessities of daily life. People wanted to help, Martha explained, as they unloaded everything. You two have become something of a symbol for this town. Proof that standing up to bullies can work, that the little guy can win sometimes. We didn't do it alone, Clara said. Everyone helped. That's what made the difference. That's my point, Marcus said, setting down a wooden chest. You taught this town to come together, to stop being afraid. That's worth more than any cabin. As evening approached and their visitors left, Jonas built a fire in the new stone fireplace, smaller than the old one, but more efficient, designed to heat the whole cabin evenly. Clara positioned herself nearby, working on some sewing, while Jonas carved a wooden sign he planned to hang above the door. What does it say? Clara asked. Jonas held it up. Hailburn Home, founded 1875. Hailburn, Clara repeated, testing the combined names. I like it. It sounds strong. Like we're a team, we are a team. The best one I've ever been part of. Clara set aside her sewing and wheeled closer to where Jonas sat. Read me something. From your father's journal. Jonas had mentioned the journal before. A small leather-bound book his father had kept, filled with observations about life, ranching, and the world. Jonas had carried it for 30 years, rarely opening it because it hurt too much to remember. But lately, he'd started reading it again. The pain was still there, but it was different now, softened by time and new joy, transformed from a wound to a bittersweet memory. He pulled the journal from his pack and opened to a page he'd marked. This is from the spring before he died. He wrote, "Saw the first calf born today. Strong little thing, up on its legs in minutes. Made me think about resilience, how some creatures are just born fighters. They take what life gives them and push through. I hope my Jonas has that in him. Hope he knows that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every single time." Jonas's voice caught slightly. "I think he'd be proud of us, of what we built here. I know he would be," Clara said softly. They sat by the fire as darkness fell, the music box playing its warped melody beside them. Jonas had tried to fix it, but Clara had asked him not to. She liked it imperfect, she said. It reminded her that broken things could still make beautiful sounds. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the new log walls. Outside, the mountain settled into its autumn night, cold but not yet frozen, waiting for the snow that would come soon enough. Jonas thought about the journey that had brought him here. The years of drifting, the grief he'd carried, the slow death of caring about anything at all. And then that morning in Willow Creek, standing in the land office with his last $5, buying a cabin everyone said was cursed. It had been cursed. Cursed with loneliness and loss and abandonment. But they'd broken that curse together, replacing it with something better. Love, community, purpose. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked. "About how life is strange. How sometimes the worst decisions lead to the best outcomes. How sometimes you find what you need when you stop looking for it. Is that what happened? You stopped looking and found me?" "I stopped running and found you," Jonas corrected. "There's a difference." Clara wheeled herself over to the window, looking out at the mountains, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "Do you think we'll be happy here? Long term, I mean. When the novelty wears off, and it's just us and the daily work of living." Jonas joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I think happiness isn't a destination. It's a practice. It's choosing each other every day, working through problems together, building something bigger than ourselves. Will there be hard days? Absolutely. But we'll face them together, and that makes all the difference." "Together," Clara repeated, liking the sound of it. "I spent so long being alone that sometimes I still can't believe I'm not anymore." "You're not alone. You'll never be alone again. That's my promise to you." They stayed at the window for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the night sounds of the forest. An owl called from somewhere deep in the trees. The creek sang its endless song. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like whispered secrets. This was home now. Not just the cabin they were building, but the land they'd fought for, the community that had rallied around them, the life they were creating together. Jonas pulled out his father's pocket watch, the one he'd given Clara during the battle with Wade, and she'd given back as a wedding gift. He wound it carefully, setting it to the correct time. For 30 years, he'd left it stopped at the moment of his father's death, frozen in grief and unable to move forward. But now it ticked steadily, counting out seconds and minutes and hours, all the time they had ahead of them to build and grow and love. "It's late," Clara said finally. "We should get some sleep. Big day tomorrow. The roof needs finishing." Jonas helped her prepare for bed, then settled onto his own bedroll near the fire. The cabin wasn't finished enough to move into yet, but soon. Another week, maybe less. As he was drifting off to sleep, Clara's voice came softly from across the room. "Jonas, thank you for staying, for fighting, for loving me when I'd forgotten how to love myself. Thank you for teaching me how to stop running," Jonas replied. "For showing me that survival isn't the same as living, and that it's never too late to choose life." No more words were needed. They'd said everything that mattered, and the rest could wait until morning. Jonas closed his eyes and listened to the fire crackling, to Clara's steady breathing, to the mountains settling around them. He thought about that $5 cabin, about Clara abandoned in her wheelchair, about the choice he'd made to stay instead of walking away. Best $5 he'd ever spent. Best choice he'd ever made. And as sleep finally claimed him, Jonas Hale smiled, knowing that tomorrow he'd wake up beside the woman he loved, in the home they'd built together, with a future stretching out ahead of them like an unwritten story waiting to be told. The mountain would always be there, strong and eternal, bearing witness to human struggles and triumphs. And in this small clearing, surrounded by forest and sky, two people who'd been forgotten by the world had found each other and built something that mattered. Not just a cabin, but a life. Not just survival, but hope. Not just love, but the courage to fight for it. That was worth more than all the money Garrett Wade had ever possessed. That was worth everything. The fire burned low, and the stars wheeled overhead, and in the new cabin on the edge of Willow Creek, two souls who'd been lost had finally found their way home.